You're listening to Product-Led Revenue, brought to you by Correlated. In each episode, you'll hear first-hand advice and tactics from SaaS, sales, and revenue leaders about using product signals to drive expansion and revenue growth. Let's jump in.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Product-Led Revenue. I'm Breezy Beaumont, and this episode is brought to you by Correlated, a customer expansion platform for B2B software companies that focus on product-led growth. Today, our guest is Glenn Weinstein, Chief Customer Officer at Twilio. Glenn, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Breezy. Glad to be here.
Awesome. So to give our audience some background on yourself, can you tell us about your role at Twilio?
Sure. Well, I'm the Chief Customer Officer here at Twilio, which makes me responsible for our customer experience generally, and more specifically, everything that happens after you decide to start using Twilio, whether that's using our customer support, maybe using our professional services team, engaging with our customer success managers, or even using one of our partners. So that's broadly my area of responsibility. And anytime customers run into difficulty with Twilio in any way, shape, or form, that's kind of my problem.
Awesome. And so for anyone listening who doesn't know what Twilio is, do you mind giving some background on the problem that you all are solving?
Good question. It is not necessarily a household name like some other software companies, but Twilio is the world's leading customer engagement platform. And I say that with no hyperbole. We really are the world's leading platform. It's a really ubiquitous technology that's used by hundreds of thousands of customers to communicate with their customers through software. So the most kind of fundamental use case that people think about when they think Twilio is, can I send a text message to a customer to give them an appointment reminder, or even something as mundane as those 6-digit codes we use to log into websites. But it really it expands beyond that. Software to connect phone calls to web applications, to be able to call out or even take calls in, have phone trees and things like that. And then it just kind of multiplies from there and gets into almost every communication channel you can imagine. And also using those communications to build tighter relationships with customers, and ultimately to build more digital transaction models, do things with customers completely online that used to require an in-person visit or some sort of other analog approach.
I think you're being modest saying that it's not exactly a household name. I think in the software world, pretty much everybody knows what Twilio is, but it's always good to give background just in case.
That's probably true. There are 10 million developers in the Twilio developer network. So almost every software developer has probably heard of Twilio. There's a ton of tutorials if you're just looking to learn JavaScript. A lot of tutorials, like one of the first things that they'll do is, let's use JavaScript and Twilio to send a text message. So there's strong educational element for software developers. But when you get into consumers, I'm not sure my parents ever heard of Twilio before I started working here, but yeah, pretty well known in the tech industry.
I guess that's true. So I believe you have well over 200,000 customers, probably even more than that, and somewhere in the ballpark of like 7,000 employees. How do you think the idea of you all being product-led helped to, and the idea that users could immediately get started and get value out of your product? How do you think that fed into that?
Well, I think actually Twilio is truly one of the pioneers of the product-led approach in software. Going back to the earliest days of Twilio, and the company was founded in 2008, it has been a developer-led motion from the very start. Twilio is all about self-service for developers. Today, I think we actually take for granted a little bit as software developers that you can go to a company's website, get a free login, get a trial account, start messing around. But Twilio was doing that back in 2008, and it's still to this day our number one source of leads. It's the number one way that companies get introduced to Twilio is when a developer on an IT team or an app dev team starts playing with Twilio and solving customer problems with it. We do have a traditional sales force that sells to enterprises and governments and things like that. But even there, the usual lead is that they're already using Twilio. The developers have already brought in Twilio. And we're just trying to, get them a volume discount or open up some new use cases or things like that. But it's pretty rare that we have a sales-led, hey, let me introduce you to Twilio. It's almost always through the product.
Yeah. And I'm excited to jump into the idea of you all introducing a sales team. I'm going to punt it down a little bit, but I'm very excited to dive into that as well, because I think that's a common question of when to do that. But before we get there, can you walk me through the process that you all have for sort of like converting and expanding those users today? Is there certain, types of data that you're looking for, or what are those sort of signals for you all?
Yeah, I would say we've applied a scientific lens to what happens when a developer starts to, first logs into signs up for a username, and all the steps that they go through, and what is the propensity to go from signing up for a Twilio account to actually using Twilio to make your first API call, to send your first message or connect your first phone call or send your first email or whatever, and then into actually starting to spend money with Twilio. All of those points on the funnel are pretty carefully mapped out, and there's a tremendous amount of analysis and also encouragement in the way that we spend our marketing dollars to encourage developers to move through that process. We want signups, and then we want signups to be successful in quickly using the product and so forth. And we apply a certain amount of effort and thought into moving them along. And then the numbers, like we've tweaked the numbers over the years of like, what does it mean to quote use Twilio? Is one API call enough? Should we wait for the user to make 5 calls, 10 calls in a day, 10 calls in a week? We've really experimented with parameters like that to kind of figure out what is legitimate usage, and then what is legitimate spend that we think is going to be permanent versus a one-time experiment.
Yeah, I think that's a topic that I've ended up talking with a lot of different folks about, is that idea of trying to find the balance of what key actions tell us that this is a good user, I think, is one question. And then the other side of that is how tight or how not so tight, like how wide should we open up those floodgates to say that this is a good user or not a good user? What has been some of that tweaking or some of the things that you all have been looking at in that process?
Yeah, well, we open the floodgates pretty wide. I'll just, there's a spectrum of how much a company values free users or values developers that may or may not turn into paid customers. Twilio is pretty far on the end of the spectrum of we just love developers, and it's a long game for us. If you don't ever spend a penny on Twilio, but you're a successful developer, we consider that a win. We have a belief that down the road you'll work for a company that finds your use case interesting, or your experience with Twilio will lead you to eventually solve problems with Twilio. So, high school and college students, university students, people in coding academies, people on coding contest websites like Topcoder, those are great avenues for Twilio, and we we never rule out a developer in that sense. We really do try to take care of all 10 million developers. And to that end, we offer free technical support to all developers, period, full stop, using the customer support team of Twilio. We have online forums and things like that. All that said, we do start to draw the line to figure out where maybe it might be helpful to reach out to a developer from a business point of view and say, can we start to talk about pricing? Is there something more that we can be doing for you? And that threshold really gets to repeatability. We're looking for developers who show a pattern that they've done something once and then it happens again the next day, and it happens again the next day. And without revealing the exact thresholds, because those are probably a little proprietary for Twilio, but the actual number of API calls or the daily spends that we consider to be sticky enough when it repeats over a series of days or weeks, that's kind of how we look at it.
Got it. I thought one concept here too is, when do we call it a win in a product-led world? When do we when does, as the sales team or just as a team, because we all like to celebrate together, when do we get to ring that gong or ring the bell and say, okay, we won this, this deal?
Yeah, well, that implies the presence of a sales team to consider a win. But that's a fascinating question in the context of Twilio, because I'm describing the pretty early stages of the funnel, but eventually customers run Twilio in mission critical profiles. There are customers that are spending significant portions of their IT budget on customer engagement through Twilio. So there's these two ends of the spectrum: customers that are sending messages for pennies, and then customers that are really, consider Twilio a strategic provider. So somewhere in between there becomes or emerges the notion of a deal or an opportunity that closes as a win. And it is tricky to pinpoint what the definition of a win is when almost all of your prospects are already customers. I mentioned that it's rare, really rare, for our sales team to engage with a prospect and find there's no use of Twilio. It's almost inevitably we look and we explain to the customer, hey, by the way, you're already using Twilio here, and there, and maybe we can stitch that together. So it's tricky to go into like a CRM system or into a sales comp plan and start to talk about, well, what are we going to define as a win that we pay a sales rep on, or that we ring the bell, as you said, Breezy, when we send that email, we want our customer. And we really kind of settled on looking at a customer's baseline spend. And that's a slippery definition too, but what we think seems to be recurring revenue from that customer, and then identify a sales use case that is incremental to their current run rates. And that's also tricky, attributing every dollar of revenue to, is this from what they're already doing or what the new thing that they're starting to do because of these sales efforts? But to the extent we can define that difference, the opportunity or the deal is the incremental above their standing run rate. And we will ring the bell when the customer either starts to spend that incremental spend, or even in a lot of cases says that they will, without necessarily committing to that, because Twilio is a usage-based model. Generally speaking, customers don't, you don't buy a yearly license to Twilio. You spend for every message, every minute of voice, every email. So even that part's tricky. Like, did the customer really commit to, soft commit, hard commit? What does that mean? But we have our definitions, and we try to gauge. Okay, I think the customer's off and they're on their way. They signed a master services agreement, maybe, and so we do put a stake in the ground and say, yeah, that's a win.
Yeah, I think what this is starting to touch on too is that idea of the sales team. So let's dive into it. When did you all decide to, introduce some top-down selling or sales motion into the Twilio process, rather than just being, self-serve with maybe a sales assist? But now I think there's a bit more of a focus. Is that the case?
Yeah, to be truthful, there's always been some sales personnel at Twilio that are there to help customers that need somebody to speak to about commercial terms and that sort of thing. But it really took off, I would say, 4 years ago. The company, roughly 3 or 4 years ago, the company made a concerted effort to build more of a traditional sales organization with some of the traditional trappings of sales, quotas and territories and things like that. That probably started about 4 years ago. And it was really just recognizing the incredible growth of Twilio, the graduation from, solely serving individual developers and software companies, and starting to get into more traditional companies. It's one thing to sell to a 2-person developer shop that's crafting, the next great contact center platform. It's another to service a traditional company with a procurement department and an IT group and formal definitions like that. And we just, really was more of a reaction to the demands on Twilio to say, to observe what our customers were doing and just needing more from Twilio, needing someone to speak to about commercial terms. That really is what led to the explosion of the sales force. Subsequently, we're just trying to be good stewards of our investor dollars here. You're going to have a sales team. It behooves you to start looking at prospecting and converting and doing a little bit of outbound selling as well. So we've gotten into that, but I don't want to misrepresent it. The outbound motion is not the primary way that Twilio sells, but it's really more to provide better services, and the services our customers need to be successful at Twilio. At some point, you just have to admit you need an account team.
Yeah. And I've heard from other companies as well who talk about the idea of introducing a little bit more of a sales motion, or that what we envision as a traditional sales motion when they're looking to move up market, or maybe when they're a portion of their customer base, like you mentioned, or user base, could actually just use help in this fashion. Like, it would be helpful for them to have a little bit of that sales conversation. Do you think that there was, a time for you all that was sort of that aha moment, like, we need to get going on a little bit more of a sales motion there?
Probably a few aha moments. Maybe one of the earliest dynamics is when you start selling a lot of something, customers are going to expect discounts based on the volumes that they're committing or spending with you. And that certainly requires a conversation. It's hard to, past a certain point of volume, it's hard to completely programmatically plug in discounts. So as we started to get some very large customers, we found the need for a conversation to retain the customer. If you're not even really offering a conversation about how can we have a mutually beneficial business relationship, you're just not really offering them a choice. Kind of in parallel with that, the first few kind of really large customers that Twilio got, we got some very frank feedback from them, basically saying, you don't know us, you don't talk to us, you don't really understand how we're using Twilio. And without that two-way conversation, we're sort of, there are others that are offering more of a conversation. So when we lost business from our first couple of really large customers, and they said, if you only would have talked to us, probably could have kept the business. That's a wake-up call. Another dynamic that's maybe specific to the industry that we're in is the amount of compliance and regulation required with telecommunications. There's a certain amount of value that Twilio provides is handling those requirements on your behalf, how to negotiate and make sure you're compliant with the telco carriers in the countries that you're operating in. And at some point, companies with security departments or compliance departments want to know, can I get a copy in writing of your security attestation, or can we talk about your compliance posture in different markets? Again, kind of hard to do that if you don't have an account team that can initiate those discussions. So, as Twilio grew and became a pretty well-known player in telecommunications, that really demanded the creation of account teams.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And what are some of the tools? Everyone always talks about what should we have in our tech stack, and so what are some of the tools that your team is using on the sales side to have those conversations, to understand how people are and other parts of the company that they might be trying to sell into, understanding how they're using the product today?
Yeah, well, I guess I would put our tool set for both our sales, kind of traditional pre-sales type teams, and then post-sales, our customer success managers, into two broad buckets. The traditional selling tools, we use a CRM, we use marketing tools, we use account-based marketing, a lot of the traditional trappings that basically, whether you're selling soap or selling software, you probably need. And then a more proprietary set of tools that give our sales and account teams more insight into customer usage patterns. And I imagine probably the more interesting part is the latter. It's different. It's a little bit unique to Twilio. Every software company is aspiring to get granular and track the way that their customers are using their products. Twilio may be a fairly extreme example of that because we don't just track the features customers use or the patterns, but we're charging them based on their usage of the product. So we have very granular data about customer spend patterns and how they translate to their usage of our APIs. The challenge is getting that data in a consumable way into the hands of an account team. I mean, we're talking about just massive amounts of transactional data that our platform is producing on a daily basis. And that data is spread across product teams, it's spread across technologies. So there's a heavy emphasis on managing and wrangling all that data, transforming it, retransforming it, recombining it, and then spitting it back out in the form of prospecting dashboards and other kinds of tools that normal humans with finite hours in the day can use and get a decent picture of their customers' usage patterns.
Yeah, and do you have a team who is sort of supporting and helping to gather these insights to make it more digestible for the rest of the team?
Yeah, we do, and to me, it's a fairly sizable team. I guess I'm not sure how it compares to other tech firms, but this is a pretty mainline function here at Twilio. There's both the kind of the bits and bytes of that, just the raw number of people that are managing our data and cleaning and integrating our data. The notion of who's a customer and what's a consumer, and that's a hard problem for any software company. It's a pretty acute problem here at Twilio with the granular nature of usage, and then a kind of a companion team doing a lot of analysis on all that data. Whether it's traditional analysis, building graphs and writing reports and sending out, we're kind of a doc-driven culture. Write it down is one of Twilio's core values. So there's a lot of written analysis that help make sense of our data. And then more recently, getting more into using machine learning to make predictions about our customers' future behavior. On paper, from afar, Twilio probably seems like an ideal realm for that because you have such granular usage. The reasons customers send SMS messages today may differ from yesterday because of such mundane things as they just run a promotion every Monday and they don't run it every Tuesday. But you just, those patterns are almost impossible to predict without throwing some machine learning at it. So we're getting a lot more sophisticated in recent years with feeding our data to ML algorithms and seeing what spits out.
What are some of these insights that, without getting too specific, but what are some of the insights that the team is hoping to pull together? What's important, what's helpful?
Well, there's two mysteries that we're sort of perpetually trying to solve with our customers' usage of the Twilio platform. One mystery is, what are their use cases? We see the end results. We see that they're sending a lot of messages. We know what destinations those messages are going to, broadly speaking. What countries and what regions and things like that. We know how much traffic they're sending over different types of channels. Not to get to telco on you here, but there's a difference between sending messages through 10-digit long code phone numbers and those 5 or 6-digit short code phone numbers and even toll-free phone numbers. So analyzing the customer's traffic to try to bucket them in an automated way into use cases. What's a marketing use case? What's a security use case? What's an appointment reminder confirmation use case? We have two-way SMS help desk use cases. And you can only get so far, like profiling your customers by talking to them. We want to get those insights from our data. So that's one kind of broad problem we're trying to solve, is introspecting the use cases. The second is not so much next propensity to what's the next step, or where is a customer likely to grow, but really, where are we seeing weakness, or where are we starting to see degradation in Twilio usage patterns? That's a little trickier to suss out as a human or from data. Customers, to back up for a second, Twilio has a really healthy net expansion rate, or dollar-based expansion rate. Customers tend to spend more with Twilio this year than they did last year, but that broad statement does mask individual customers' behavior, where some customers do have their usage kind of drift away over time gradually. And we're looking for better ways to pick up that signal earlier on before it gets to a 20% or a 50% drop. And eventually it triggers a salesperson or a CSM to ask the customer what happened, and at that point you get the story. But we'd love to kind of see those signals as soon as they start showing up, even if they're not visible to the naked eye.
Yeah, I think that's a common struggle for teams to see, is sort of some of the trends in the data. So seeing the raw data, aggregating data, and all those things. You still require a large team to support those use cases, but sometimes seeing the trends in that data and seeing that, in quote unquote real time or close to real time, and being able to take action quickly on it, I think is obviously, something that we are hoping to help solve over at Correlated, of course, but I think it's still something that a lot of teams struggle with today and as they continue to grow.
Yeah, I think the only way to do that is using tools like machine learning that can spot patterns sooner and make predictions that this one is going to turn into a 30% degradation, most likely. So our humans cannot do it. We've learned that we're going to need machines to do that.
Yeah, that makes sense. What are some of the, downstream ways that you all are, kicking off campaigns or talking to folks? So let's say, your data team's there, they're helping to build together these dashboards and insights. Then your sales or customer success or whoever's sort of the end user of that data is then going to take action. And what tools are they using at that point to reach out to users or accounts?
Yeah, well, first we use our own technology, of course. Twilio makes lots of great tools for outreach, including call down lists. The techniques we use are pretty traditional, but the tools I think we use are pretty Twilio exciting from a Twilio perspective. SMS campaigns. Twilio, as much as any other company, recognizes that SMS is both a powerful communications mechanism for outbound, but also one that requires a great deal of responsibility because consumers, even prospects, should only receive messages that they want, that they've asked for. So we model that behavior in our own outbound campaigns to establish a relationship with the customer and have them opt into how they want to be communicated with, and then communicate with them on their chosen channel. But when you scratch below all the technical details, we have a team of SDRs, we have CSMs, we have account executives, and they're just prospecting just like any team in any software company in Silicon Valley or elsewhere.
Got it. Very cool. All right, I'm going to switch gears on this one and bring up pricing. So do you have usage-based pricing? I think I know the answer here, but I'd love to get your take on it and some of the challenges with that. Maybe, obviously forecasting can be a challenge, or predictability, but I'd love for you to jump in there.
Yeah, I don't know if that's a standard question on the Product-Led Revenue podcast. Do you have usage pricing? Yeah. Twilio has usage pricing. It's kind of our claim to fame. We're one of the earliest and most aggressive companies in marketing the fact that we do have true usage-based pricing. And to me, I come to Twilio from the technology world. I'm a computer science person, broadly speaking, and a degree in computer science. So I'm thinking of the world as I think of Twilio as much as a great cloud technology as a communications technology. And it's one of the reasons I'm really excited to be at Twilio, really. I mean, what I see Salesforce and Workday did in their spaces for CRM and ERP, moving from traditional on-premise tech to the cloud is what I'm proud to be a part of at Twilio, moving communications and customer engagement from that's a very traditional on-premise business into the cloud. And so go back to the original promise of cloud computing, a decade and a half ago. It was supposed to be, one of the key advantages was supposed to be usage-based pricing. Pay for what you need. I think there's a car insurance company that says that, but yeah, pay for what you need. You don't have to buy servers and lay down cables and make this giant capital investment before you start using computing power. So, not all cloud companies have lived up to that great notion of, not requiring big upfront contracts and seat purchases. And, you still see with some cloud vendors, what should be an antiquated notion of shelfware. You still see that in our industry, but not at Twilio. Twilio is really, one of the great examples of a usage-based pricing model. And the great thing about usage-based pricing is truly a win-win, to throw another cliche out there. But I mean, it's good for the customer. Clearly, you only pay for what you use, and it's really good for Twilio. It sort of trusts the customer that if we produce a good product, we service that product, and we stay in touch with your needs, and we're being a good partner to you, you'll use more of it. You'll naturally use more of it because it's succeeding in achieving whatever objective you're trying to achieve. Look at Twilio's net expansion rates. I mentioned earlier, like customers tend to spend more every year, and that's pretty significantly more than most software companies. And we do that not because they're locked into a 2,000 seat contract, but just because they're getting more value from the platform every year. So like we are really committed and true believers in usage-based pricing model. Okay. Now, all that said, you asked a little bit about like, okay, how do you look at pricing? We're also in a hyper-competitive and highly fragmented market. Every country you send a message in or connect a voice call in is a different set of telecommunications providers, different routing, and different pricing. So our pricing at Twilio is kind of incredibly complex. And I'm sorry to say that as the chief customer officer. We're trying to make it simpler, but there is an innate complexity to communicate, to pricing for these highly granular communications.
Yeah, I think this is a common play, is that pricing is the usage-based pricing sometimes can be done on different parameters of usage and this and that, but a lot of times it's directly tied to the cost of goods sold, COGS, right? So it sounds like that's a big factor that goes into, especially with all these different communications around the globe for you all.
Yeah, so let's get into that a little, Breezy. Like, how exactly do we compose our pricing? A lot of what Twilio does have direct COGS, cost of goods sold. When we send an SMS message, we're paying the carrier to carry that message. I think we consumers in the past 6 or 8 years, at least in the US and actually increasingly around the world, have become a little numb to that because you generally get unlimited texting with your personal cell phone. But it's not free. It's baked into your monthly contract. And it's certainly not free at a business to consumer level. There is a cost to every message. So we're passing along that cost to our customers, along with some modest, and I say that sincerely, a modest markup to cover Twilio's costs, and the value that we add on top of that message through our really rich APIs. But nevertheless, at the end of the day, you do have these COGS that come and go, and they change on a daily, sometimes an hourly basis, and it does affect our pricing to the extent that we can get dynamic on our pricing and offer the best market price to the customer in for the routing in the region that they're in. The better off we'll be competitively, especially when you talk about high volume customers. So so we have this sort of floor. We don't want to sell at a loss below our COGS. But we also need to be as competitive as possible. If our competitors have more dynamic pricing, they'll eventually win in the market. So that's a big challenge for Twilio. Now, not everything we sell has COGS. There's a certain amount of quote unquote software that Twilio sells. Our contact center solutions. There are aspects of our various platforms that don't necessarily have direct telecommunications COGS. And in those areas, we are able to make a higher gross margin, which you're just like any other software company, we're trying to find the right price point, continue to innovate on the product. And that's a little bit more of a traditional pricing arena for Twilio as a software company. But majority of what Twilio is dealing with is based on COGS.
Yeah, I think the good thing about usage-based pricing too is that there's an understanding, at least most of the time, I'd like to think, from the user that as you use this more, first of all, obviously there's the value piece of it, but also there's an understanding that as you use it more, you are causing more costs on the other side. So you understand like what you're paying for. It's like when you buy anything else as a consumer, like if you go out and buy more food, you pay more money. Like there's that like consumption level of understanding at the most, trying to give the most basic analogy I could think of there. But there's an understanding that as you consume more, you pay more. And instead of having those sort of like, what we traditionally would see in software as it being strictly on a tier base and usually very minimal tiers, maybe 1 or 2, it lets you sort of do as you will.
I think that's true. There is an understanding from our customers that surely somebody has to eventually bear costs for carrying communications. But I don't think Twilio customers are any more generous than any in any other industry to allow Twilio to just pass those costs along unquestioned. It's a very competitive market. Customers are demanding the best pricing they can get, and it's really up to Twilio to add value on top of that COGS to really earn our spot in this world. I think an analogy that comes to mind for me with Twilio is, you can get very bare bones, no frills, raw materials from Home Depot, which is a great customer, by the way. But you don't have to buy a finished house. You can buy wood and nails and whatnot, and that's cheaper than buying a finished house. But most customers are going to are willing to pay for the expertise required to just make sure that job gets done right. There are cheaper providers than Twilio in different markets and in different channels, but it tends to be sort of spotty. You'd have to put together your own global network of providers, which is a significant value that Twilio adds. And then let's not forget, Twilio is a really world-class API company, and the APIs that Twilio provides add enormous value, and they're kind of free in a way because there's no specific charge for our APIs. When you send messages to Twilio, you just get our API. So those are two avenues that we use to add value on top of those COGS. I don't know too many customers that are willing to say, Twilio, I'm sure it's very expensive for you to carry my messages. Take my money. They're looking for the value add, and they'll take their business elsewhere the moment they perceive we're not adding that value.
Yeah. There's definitely, a huge value add, and in true product-led fashion, the product is at the forefront of it. So of course there's those COGS and things, but making sure that you have the best product in the market and you're always innovating to make that better for your users and your customers. I mean, I think there's no question there. I have sort of my last question here is to ask you, what piece of advice would you give to product-led companies who are just getting started today?
Have faith in your customers, that they will, if you build a group of committed evangelists and you're providing a great product, it really does start with a product that adds value, that the widest net will catch the most fish, I guess. Let your product be played with, experimented with. Don't do the traditional kind of, you want to talk to us, fill out this form. Let them fill out the form when they're ready to when they want to talk to you, not as a gatekeeper, as a way to prevent access to your product. Have faith in your vision. If your product is great, more exposure is better. It's PR 101. Get it out there, get it to the masses, figure out how to monetize it later. Not to sound like such a stereotypical VC, but there is a lot of truth to that, actually, that get your product out there, and if it's providing real value, you will be able to monetize it.
Awesome. I love it. Well, I think we're coming up on time. So where should people go to learn more about you and to learn more about Twilio?
I'm out there on Twitter. Glenn Weinstein. I got my own name a long time ago. 2 N's in Glenn, by the way. But Twilio.com, right there, top right of the page, sign up, and you will be a Twilio developer within 5 minutes. SendGrid.com is our email platform, and Segment.com is our customer data platform. They each also offer their own logins, and you can get underway as a developer on any of those platforms as well.
Awesome. Well, Glenn, thanks again. I really appreciate you spending some time with us today, and it was awesome to have you on Product-Led Revenue.
Thank you, Breezy.
Thanks for checking out this episode of Product-Led Revenue. This show is brought to you by Correlated, the first platform built for product-led revenue. If you enjoyed what you learned in this episode, make sure to follow the Product-Led Revenue podcast wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, or visit getcorrelated.com/podcast to get access to all of the latest episodes.